city dwellers, and so I'd love to get your sense of what you love about being an urban dweller and a city dweller. Kim.
Look, I think this story about the planet becoming more urban, becoming more than half urban, is a good story. I think that this is going to be the way in which we solve many of the major problems of the planet. And the two big ones, the looming ones, are global poverty and climate change. I think that learning how to live in cities, learning how to live more sustainably, more effectively, at higher densities in cities is it's going to be the big success story of this century. So I'm actually very positive about cities. I think urban living is fantastic, and what's most fantastic about it is that cities are the great engines of change. They're the spatial machines almost that bump us into each other and into new ideas and new kinds of people and new ways of living, more effective ways of living. So I'm not usually seen as an out-and-out optimist in this way, but I do think that this urbanisation of the planet is a good news story. And if there is anyone out there who's worried about population growth, the move to cities is one of the great antidotes to overpopulation. Wow. In a strange way.
We'll have good things to talk about there. Helen, what about you?
Well, I enjoy many of the aspects of living in the city in a similar way to Kim, in that I find that the city is an exciting place to live. It's a place where there are ideas and creativity. There's always something going on. I think our cities are changing, and they're changing rapidly, perhaps more rapidly in the here and now than they have in the past. And for me personally, I did what a lot of people do. I left home. I lived in a suburban environment. I moved all over the place. I rented for many years. But when it came to purchasing a home, I basically purchased something as close to where I used to live as possible, which I found quite interesting because when I was young, all I wanted to do was get away from there and feel free from, the bounds of that community. When I decided to purchase, I felt like I wanted to return to a community where I had a sense of my own place.
What was pulling you back?
History, memory, the known versus the unknown. And I'd certainly lived in lots of unknown places just during the interim. But I also purchased something for me that had a very large backyard that I've transformed for myself into a place of reflection. And that was what I was looking for, in addition to the location.
Okay, interesting. Bernard, how about you? You're very much an urban dweller. Just bring that mic forward a little bit.
Yes, I am an urban dweller, but I was born or raised in a small country town in Victoria, so I have a good appreciation, I think, of rural life. But for me personally, I think that cities offer opportunity. Melbourne at 4 million, for example, is a global city. Sydney at 4 million is a global city. And the opportunities that are attached to those cities are global. You can work for a corporation that can take you anywhere in the world if you live in Melbourne, if you live in Sydney. And I think that's an enormously attractive proposition, particularly to young people today. If you look at the demographics of Australia over, say, the last generation or so, whereas in the 1960s, young people would remain in the country town that I was born in country Victoria, and work on a farm or work in a shop or whatever. Today you can see the demographics clearly, an outflow of young people from 18 through to 24 out of there into the city for job opportunities, education, training, and the frisson, if you like, that you get from 4 million people clustered together. Sure, we can make these things work better, but there is an argument that there is more opportunity. I think the American academic Richard Florida put his finger on this 10 years ago with his book The Rise of the Creative Class, which argued that because of density, that there was greater opportunity, greater creativity associated with communities. I suspect, though, that if this forum was being held in Byron Bay, there would be a very different view. Now, I think we need to differentiate between metropolitan areas and rural and remote Australia. There's another type of Australia, which is the lifestyle areas of the coast and tree change areas, which are really almost extensions of capital city thinking and values.
And that's what you documented in The Big Shift,
That's
wasn't
exactly
it? The
right.
big move of
exactly.
the baby boomers to the coastal areas.
That's right. I actually see that as an extension of the city. The sort of people that you see in Byron Bay or Mornington Peninsula, Bellarine Peninsula, or up the coast, down the coast outside Queensland, or Central Coast in New South Wales, are really big city people with big city values. But you don't see those values, those people, those demographics, if you like, west of the Great Divide. If you look at the demographics of Australia, what you would say is we cannot stand the remote areas of Australia. We're leaving those areas, and to the extent that we're now flying in, flying out. We want to live in the cities, and there is now a weekly flight from Karratha to Melbourne for miners. We don't want to live in Karratha. We'd much rather live in Melbourne. That's what the demographics are actually saying at the moment.
So that pull is there.
It's very much there at the moment, very much for this generation.
Senway, what about yourself? You've actually visited hundreds of cities around the world.
Yes.
You live in Sydney. What draws you to the city personally?
I think city answers a lot of questions and a lot of issues that we have. Urbanisation, actually, what Kim is right, actually. It answers a lot of issues that we are faced at the moment. Whether we like it or not, the world is becoming urbanized. Let's not forget, I mean, in 1987, the world's population was 5 billion. End of this month, it will be 7 billion. It's an increase of 2 billion people in the space of a short time. So what we got to focus on is basically how can we address all these issues. So what we want to do is focus on creating greener, more healthy living environment so that everyone can actually live more comfortably.
Interesting. I mean, Helen, we have a tendency to pathologise cities, don't we? I mean, they are the kind of reason for so many ills. And certainly, if we look at our mental health and well-being, levels of anxiety, levels of depression, of schizophrenia, of a whole range of different mental afflictions are actually much higher in cities. Why is that? We've sung the praises of cities, but there are some pathologies associated with cities as well, and high-density living.
In part, I think that people need to have a choice, and many people don't have choice about where they're able to live and what they're able to afford. And so what I found is that often people living in public housing, in particular high-rise public housing, as you mentioned earlier, people there are often very isolated and they're living in a very high-density situation. But it's a situation that can come with a number of social issues attached to it around fear, whether it's perception or reality, incivilities, use of substances, etc., that creates a tension for those people living in those environments where they feel often very attached to their own home, their own flat, where they have some influence and some control, and they feel very attached to the amenities which surround their community, such as hospitals, places to shop, libraries, etc. But the space in between is a space where many people consider that they aren't safe, and so the navigation through that space can be quite lead to some trauma for some people and lead to severe isolation about them shutting themselves away from that in order to feel safe and secure.
It's one of the great ironies, isn't it, that we can feel profoundly lonely in a crowd. So high-density living isn't going to necessarily make us feel like we've got company.
No, it doesn't. It doesn't. I actually asked people living in high-rise public housing, I was very interested in where they thought their neighbours were. And I expected, I guess, for people to say, that this floor, my neighbours are here. But people actually said my neighbours are those people, those people, those people and those people. They're the people that have a direct influence.
I actually argue that the concept of neighbourhood has shifted. If you go back a generation, people used to hang over the back fence and chat with the neighbour. Whereas today, I think you are much more likely to hang over the office partition and chat with your neighbour. You're getting the sort of relationship that you used to get from your neighbour. You're getting that from your workmate. And so this leads to my argument that the neighbourhood is not necessarily a geography out in the burbs. It's more of a virtual space that I mix with my workmates. I'll go to shop or restaurants or whatever with my... That is the new neighbourhood, not necessarily the suburb. It's almost like a 20th century notion the concept of the neighbourhood.
Over the back fence.
Over the back fence, yeah.
Or we have virtual neighbourhoods, don't we?
Well, we do. Virtual neighbourhoods and virtual groups, friends, tribes, all of that. All about now being recast, I think, in the 21st century.
Kim, I was struck in some of your writing. The term urban actually comes from Latin for, is it urbanus? Yeah. Which actually means courteous and polite. Which I thought many urban contexts are sort of far from courteous and polite. They're actually quite rude and
the urban condition
horrendous.
is one where we have to develop codes of conduct where we respect difference, where we continuously encounter people who have different views to us, people we may not agree with, who may be our neighbours but may not be our friends. That's the urban condition, and so we develop codes of courtesy, of conduct, which are civilised, and that's a part of what cities do, I think. I just wanted to come back to one of these points too about crowding and this capacity to be isolated. It is an irony that you can be isolated in the highest density environments. Crowding is one of those strange two-sided terms. I mean, we've got a pretty good crowd here tonight, but when you say a good crowd, that stands in contrast, I'm sorry, to what you might regard as feeling crowded. I don't think anyone in here tonight feels crowded. You call this a good crowd because it's full and so on. It may well be that when the event finishes and everyone wants to squeeze out through the one door, they're going to feel crowded. So this thing about density is very, very psychological and very time-dependent as well as spatially dependent. That you can have a really good crowd, you can have 100 people in your house and you call it a good crowd. If you had to live there, you might call it crowded. So what we call crowding and the kind of stress and the negative effects of that often have to do with internal conditions, with the overcrowding of internal space. And in my understanding, there's no real evidence at all of overcrowding in public space having any deleterious effect whatever.
Oh, that's really interesting because this seems to me to be very much a state of mind thing. Senway, you spend a lot of time in the megacities of the world where crowding is overwhelming for those of us who, live in the burbs. Mm. Is it a state of mind?
Absolutely. I mean, some countries in the world, they've been living in very high density for generations. And it really is in a state of mind, and the sense of happiness people feel actually based on your sense of control. If you have more sense of control over what you're doing, generally you feel happier. And if you have less sense of control, whether you live out in the suburbs or wherever, you'll actually feel less happy.
What sort of control, though? I mean, let's take one of those massive, crowded megapolises that you spend time in.
Yes.
Can people have a sense of control? How do they institute that sense of control?
Yes and no, I suppose. Quite a few things we can't control, obviously. For a lot of people living, for example, in big cities like Shanghai and so forth, the quality of air, the quality of water, something you can't really control. But in terms of who you associate with, where you go, certainly you can control that.
Interesting. Bernard, you think that the inner city living will never quite do it for Australians the way nature strips do.
No, that's right. I've got a soft spot for the burbs. I think Australian cities can be improved, but this idea that we're all going to dense up and live in high-rise apartments, no, certainly some people will, but we have a cultural attachment to suburbia, and no place more so than Melbourne. We in Melbourne invented the quarter-acre block and the three-bedroom brick veneer, and we're very proud of it. Barry Humphries came and celebrated suburbia. It's the first real Australian iconography, if you like, coming out of Melbourne suburbia. Neighbours is an invention of Melbourne, filmed in Pinnock Crescent, South Vermont, projected Melbourne suburbia to the world for 30 years. Showcasing our lifestyle.
Excellent.
And, of course, it had incredible resonance in the UK. And then Kath and Kim, a recent incarnation, if you like, of exactly the same thing.
But these
celebrating
people are lampooning suburbia.
Sorry?
They're lampooning suburbia.
Humphries... lampooning or celebrating. I don't think it's actually mean. I don't think it's a negative.
He comes back to defend Melbourne because he needs it in order to continue his career.
Well, he's been incredibly successful. And I think yes, there is a little edge to it, but I think that's the nature of humour. But I also think it's a celebration. I mean, Melburnians wouldn't accept it. I mean,
But that doesn't
you
mean
have to be
it's a
popular with the
sustainable way
massive.
of living in cities.
Sorry?
It doesn't mean it's sustainable. If the suburbs can't sustain frequent public transport,
That's a
then
different
they
argument.
really don't have a future.
Don't disagree with that. We're talking about the cultural affinity that Melburnians and Australians feel for suburbia.
But they can
and
change.
my point is that it's so strong. It's been there for 50, 60 years, probably 100 years or so. It's not going to change easily. I agree that it needs to change. But it's like turning a supertanker. Don't expect it to turn quickly. It might take 20 or 30 years to get the level of density that you're actually pursuing.
When you contrast it with high-rise, I think you drop into the kind of polarisation that's done so much damage to the debate in Australia. The best forms of high density are not high-rise. And this notion that if you abandon the suburbs, then we're all going to live in high-rise is complete nonsense. All of the best urban design schemes for higher density living are not simply high-rise towers dotting the landscape. They tend to be medium density. They use different housing types. And indeed, many of the ones that haven't hardly been tried in Melbourne are between about 5 and 8 stories high. The kind of housing we simply don't build here because the industry is not geared for it.
I don't have a problem with that, and I think that is certainly the way that Melbourne and Sydney and other cities will evolve. That is the densification, particularly of transportation corridors, railway stations and so forth, 3, 5, 7 or 8 stories out in the burbs. But it's that broad swathe of suburbia that fits in between those corridors that I think hold a culture, a value, if you like, that goes to the heart of Australian values, that you can't... it's going to be difficult to change.
What does that mean, Bernard? Goes to the heart of Australian values. Values change with generations.
Well, they do. But why are we growing places like on the edge of Melbourne? This idea of McMansions, if you like. On the one hand, we say yes, we need to sensible, 4, 5, 6, 7-storey developments or high-rise, and yet there is a mass market out there that still wants that. And it's almost like this conflict. You've got two tribes inhabiting our capital cities.
As well,
but how do you
it's
know
affordability and also preference.
How do you know the market wants that if that's all that the market has ever force-fed?
Look, if the market...
the development industry doesn't provide anything else. The developers sit in the minister's office, they say, let's extend the growth boundary again, we'll have lots of cheap agricultural land out on the urban fringe, and we just go through another round of exactly the same thing, and then everyone says, well, that's what the market wants.
But if the market wanted that, then profit-driven developers would deliver that. It's as simple as that. Why would they not pursue the path of least resistance to nose profit? If that's what the majority want, then that's it. My point is, I'd love to see that, very happy to see that, but there is still this resonance, if you like, of suburbia that strikes a chord with middle metropolitan Australia.
Is that not the great Australian dream?
It has been the great Australian dream, and it needs to change, and it has changed dramatically.
What is the... I mean, you think that urban densification has become something of a doctrine. Just briefly, why?
Well, look, I'm not against densification at all. In fact, Kim and I were talking in the green room previously, very supportive of that. I'm a supporter of a diversity of housing across capital cities. And I think most modern town planning thinking is there should be a diversity of housing options, low density, medium density, high density. And it's a question of how you can deliver all of those combinations, if you like, in our capital cities. So you have densification within a 10, 15k radius, you have densification along transportation railway corridors, but you also have sensibly planned, master planned transportation infrastructure delivered, low density suburban areas as well, to meet the demand as required by some Australians.
Senway, is this a rather indulgent conversation that we're having here as Australians with all this space to indulge ourselves in? In the countries that you're working in and consulting to, space is not even a luxury they can even contemplate.
Yes, in some countries you're right. We represent, for example, 0.3% of the world's population. In some countries like China and India, they've got to absorb another, for example, China's got to absorb another 350 to maybe 500 million people in the next 20, 25 years. They've already absorbed about 300 million of people coming into the urban areas. So that calls for a lot more urbanization. a lot more use of resources, obviously, and in terms of environmental pollution and all these other issues that we are faced with. So what we're trying to do is, obviously, we realize it's happening. Whether we like it or not, it's happening. What we're trying to do is try to make it a friendlier process by providing cost-effective solutions. You know, what we do is pretty simple. We find the best experts we can find around the world and introduce them to government authorities who are looking for these solutions.
So you're working with governments of some of these countries like China
Yes.
to work out, okay, if you're going to have all these people, if we're going to densify and build new cities as China is right across the country, it's extraordinary to see some of those new countries rising up from the ground. Actually, I've been there briefly and I was sort of staggered by it.
And it's happening, yes.
But, I mean, so how do you approach the conversation with them? I mean, is it even possible to have a sustainable approach to building cities that are rising up so fast?
Yes and no. Yes, you're going to cause environmental damage if you are urbanizing, like building cities. You are going to cause quite a bit of damage. But you can actually do it in a friendlier way and a less damaging way. So that's what we're just trying to do. We're providing solutions and showing better ways of doing things.
So around wastewater, around...
In terms of master planning, for example, friendlier way, a better way of master planning cities, in terms of introducing them to different engineering solutions, in terms of recycling, in terms of wastewater management, and things like that.
Helen Killmier, Senway's just talked about friendly places and more friendly processes, and you're interested, as you are, Kim, in what makes a space a place. Now, what's the distinction you're getting at there, and why is it so important in this conversation about rapid population growth?
It's been said that place is space filled up by people's, I guess, emotional investment, by the bonds that people form, that a space is a space until such time as somebody invests within that space, and then it can become a place. My interest is in place attachment and how people form effective bonds with their communities, their homes, and whether or not there's any overlap with the constructive sense of community. And the literature is quite divided about both constructs at the moment in terms of whether sense of community and place attachment sit side by side, have overlap, or are separate constructs. So they're very difficult to measure.
I can tell you're doing PhD constructs. What does it mean to be attached to a place, do you think? And why is it important to our well-being, our sense of well-being?
What I found with people who have a high attachment to place is that it tends to be, it's about their emotional investment in the place. And so that place for them is frequently filled with memories, memories of children leaving. You know, one woman said to me, "This is where my daughter left for her wedding. You know, this place is full for me of memories and history, and good times and bad times. But this is where I've lived out my life." And so, this was a woman who was actually living, I think, on the 18th floor of a high-rise public housing building. And I said to her, "What is it like, living up here?" And she said, "Oh, this isn't my home." I said, "Oh, I'm sorry, where's your home?" She said, "I'm down on the 5th floor." And so for me it was about saying, well, does that make a difference? And for her it was saying, well, the 5th floor is my home and the 18th floor is where I've been temporarily relocated while they're renovating it. So place is a particularly important construct, I think, for people and is very tied up with their emotional affect and the way that they feel about the place. Many places also have a negative connotation, and people can feel attached to a place that for them may have a negative feeling. It could be that people still visit the graves of people who are passed on, and that may not be a pleasant memory, but there's a strong attachment to the place where that event took place, where that person's located. So there's a shadow side to place attachment. That people still go and visit the Holocaust, the sites of the Holocaust and Auschwitz, etc. And those places have no good memories for people, and yet they're a place where many people feel a very strong attachment.
Which is interesting. If we think about new urban developments rising up from the dust in Australia to accommodate a growing population in urban centres, this question of just being able to kind of land community in a place. So you're doing part of your PhD is involved in the Docklands in Victoria, which is emblematic of a lot of similar developments around Australia, Darling Harbour in Sydney and others in Perth and Brisbane as well. And yet it's not straightforward. You just can't sort of... It's like the sea monkey phenomena, isn't it? I think someone described it. You can't just have a little bunch of crystals and add a bit of water and there you've got community.
That's right. Community is something that forms on its own from the grassroots up. Whilst a number of developers, particularly recently, have, I guess, sold the idea of, we're creating a community out here in Wallen, for want of a better place. And so when you come to our community, you're joining something. Really often what happens is that until people live there, there is no sense of community until they develop it themselves. So there's often not enough infrastructure, and the infrastructure usually catches up with the population moving in rather than the other way around. So people create their own sense of community, whatever that may be. And for people now, it can be virtual. A lot of people are showing me that Facebook is one of their strongest senses of community, and that's a community in virtual land.
So they're inside their apartment, inside an urban desert, surrounded by concrete, having a great old time. Yeah. Bernard.
One of the very fashionable ideas, I think for about the last 20 years in town planning has been the notion of urban villages. If you really want to...
that really gets your goat.
If you really want to turn on a town planner, you say urban village. Or put the word sustainable urban village, and they just love it. Just love it. The City of Sydney is a good example of this. Clover Moore has a strategic plan for turning the City of Sydney, that is the municipality of Sydney, into urban villages. So you have Ultimo and Piermont and Surrey Hills and Paddington and Darling Harbour, whatever it is.
What is an urban village? Is it
this is the point. It's like an urban village is like an idea where you know your neighbour and you chat across the road and you're feeling connected and you know the butcher and the butcher knows you. I don't want to live in an urban village. This is my point about neighbourhood. I get more social validation, connection, if you like, through my workplace. And then when I want to go home to the suburbs, I simply want to go to sleep. I don't want to chat with my neighbour. I don't want to chat over the fence. I've chatted at work. I just want to go home. And I don't want to know the name of my butcher.
So it's a case of bugger community for Bernard.
Yeah, no, I don't want the butcher to know me. I don't want to know the butcher. And this is my concept in the 21st century.
You asocial creature.
No. This is 21st century thinking. That if the nature of neighbourhood has changed, I'm getting social connection, validation, but it's just different. And if we are going to have a truly diverse metropolitan area, then there should be a place in a metropolitan area for bizarre people like me.
Who don't want to be part of the community.
You're involved in work, then you come home, and then you get... everyone else can have community, but...
We'll
I minimise it, actually. That's true.
Kim, what about, how do you think about this? I mean, you're interested in healthy places, and healthy isn't about just, what makes us sick and what makes us well. It's actually about a sense of community.
Good cities have got plenty of room for people like Bernard, but also lots of others. I think most people, including Bernard probably, invest their sense of identity in places, in cities, at places at every level. We invested in Australia, we invested in Melbourne, we invested in particular neighbourhoods within that. Sometimes I think it becomes a kind of a fetish. The research I've been doing on urban character, one of the things it revealed was, and this is based in Melbourne, but I think it's true elsewhere as well, that when you scratch this question of urban or neighbourhood character, what you find is something really quite fluid. And that in some neighbourhoods it means it's a kind of a protected, inward-looking sense of this place must not change because we're very invested in keeping it exactly the way it is, perhaps for heritage reasons in some cases. In other cases, though, there are very, very different kinds of identification with place. Some suburbs are defended because of their mix, because they're diverse, and that it's seen that new developments, perhaps bulky developments, perhaps overdevelopment, what's seen as overdevelopment, is actually threatening the very diversity and mix of that neighbourhood rather than the purity of it. So place can mean many things, and it can change. Sure, I agree with Bernard that Australians have become very, very heavily invested in suburbia. I'd say over-invested, because I think that these things can change, and indeed they have to change, because low-density suburbia that cannot support frequent public transport simply has no future in a low-carbon world. You cannot reconcile that, so that the Australian suburbs, and we have so much suburbia, I see no reason in trying to produce more of it. What I see the real task is to produce transit-oriented development that will bring walkable access to good public transport, frequent public transport. That means no timetable. It means you turn up and the transport turns up.
Just pick up on that point, you public transport. I agree with that. It'd be fantastic to actually have railway lines out to Werribee. The North West Railway link in Sydney is a good example. South West down to Bringelly would be terrific.
But whose houses are going to go to accommodate it?
It's how much does it cost? It's $5 billion to run a 47-kilometre railway line from Southern Cross Railway Station in Melbourne to Wyndham Vale. That's 100. What's 47 into $5 billion, whatever that cost is.
But what is the cost of not having that key
Well, no, there's another
infrastructure?
way. There's another way. Everyone says, well, let's get public transport. Yep, that's terrific. If we can afford it, I agree with that. There is another way you can do this that meets our carbon footprint, and that is the decentralisation of jobs. Why are we taking people from Cranbourne, from Penrith, from Caboolture into the CBD every day to a job? Isn't it easier to take the job to the person? So let's take jobs out of the CBD and seed them in Werribee, in Castle Hill, in Mount Gravatt, in Joondalup, in Perth, so that people can ride to work. It's the Canberra model, if you like, containerisation of the city. One approach is to have really, really expensive public transport. Yep, terrific, great. Another thing is to provide incentives, town planning incentives, whatever incentives, to decentralise jobs. There's 250,000 jobs in the centre of Melbourne. Let's take 80,000 and seed them around the metropolitan area so that you're actually reducing the carbon footprint. People live, work, play, recreate, go to work, go to hospital, go to university, all within the same area. That, to me, is a better model for the future.
Kim, what's your thought about that redistribution?
Oh, it's obvious. Yeah, no, I agree with that. But I don't think it works without good public transport. Public transport is cheap. This notion of can we afford public transport, people don't seem to say that when they're talking about roads, the upkeep of roads and the construction of new roads. We've got to stop servicing the car. I mean, a large piece of the problem with making cities work better is to get the kind of network flows, the distributed network flows. That's how cities work. They're growth engines, and that they work by connecting people to each other and to ideas and to products and so on, and that they have to flow. And the car network and the extent to which parking keeps us apart from each other has become completely out of control.
Kim,
we have to turn that around.
Kim, in some of your work, you've looked at groups who have opposed urban densification.
Yep.
What are the major concerns about densifying our cities? And I guess implicit in this, we're assuming that population is going to grow, and I'm sure that's going to come up with audience discussion and questions. But if we assume that population is going to grow, as problematic as that is for some people, what are the concerns about densification?
I think it presses some buttons that are probably unnecessarily in many cases, that people see it as being overwhelmed. They see their own sense of worth and of power and of identity being overwhelmed by high-rise buildings, by too many people and so on. So there's a kind of a dystopian psychology almost.
Is it an aesthetic thing as well?
I think in part that, but I also think that there's a complete lack of vision. We haven't put our design imagination to work enough in this country to produce the kind of visions of urban futures that can catch the public imagination and bring them with us. Because I do think that when the planning is done well and people feel that they're still in charge of their future, they will accept much, much more change than is usually regarded to be the case, where people are simply forming resident groups and digging their heels in and saying, not in my backyard. I think there's a lot of examples where one of my PhD students did a case study which was in Canada, where the planning was done particularly well, and the entire community went through a major intensification process around a railway line, and they argued at the end that the urban character had been preserved, and yet there'd been massive, massive physical changes. What they were really saying was that the character and identity of the community that they really cared about was primarily social, and that it was quite possible then to bring in massive changes that as long as that sense of social identity and community were somehow respected through that process.
Helen Kuhlmeier, you've been involved in quite a lot of community-type consultations, haven't you, in local government situations. What makes the difference?
One of the things I used to say to some of the councils that I worked in was, do you want a thorough process or do you want a quick process? Do you want people to really come on board? Do you really want to consult with the communities? And if so, it's going to take this much time to do that and to provide people with a real opportunity to have some input.
But sometimes consultation around new developments can just be we'll just do that, we'll make them all feel good. And in fact, in the end, people feel like they've got no power. The development still happens, or a version of it, or the tree comes down, or, is it a sort of hopeless battle, despite what councils say?
I actually think that the community always has much more power than it thinks it does. And should it choose to mobilise that power, it can be an amazing force to be reckoned with. However, it requires cooperation and a certain level of cohesion for that to happen. But I've seen that happen where decisions have been overturned. Then, of course, they go to VCAT, and that's a whole other story. But at the
I think there are some very powerful examples of where the community has blocked projects or developments. And a good example of that is in Perth with the Cottesloe Beach proposal to have high-rise on the beach, and the locals have decided no, and that's blocked that project. Camberwell here in Melbourne is another example where that has been blocked. So there are examples on key sites around Australia where... The Green Triangle, was it the St Kilda Triangle? Is it good? Green Triangle, whatever it is.
St Kilda Triangle,
So there are key sites, and I suppose there might be other examples where it might have gone the other way.
But the comeback to some of those campaigns might be, well, look, the population's growing, we have to share the load here, development is inevitable.
Well, but if the community, in a democratic community, if a majority of people say, no, we don't want that, then the system responds accordingly. So it's not as if the community does not have power. In fact, there are some great examples of where the community has had the authority and changed the outcome.
Senway,
you have to distinguish between where that opposition is legitimate and where it isn't. So Camberwell, for instance, where there's a two-storey hole in the ground that just crying out for redevelopment that is being resisted and was being resisted.
I actually agree with you on that.
Compared to doing high-rise development on the foreshore where you're casting the beach into shadow and so on. Yeah. So there are legitimate forms of resident resistance, and there are some dubious ones.
I actually agree with you on those specific. I don't like the word legitimate and illegitimate. If the majority of people say we don't want that, then that's legitimate in a democracy. That's the way I would see it.
But the majority of people in Camberwell want to stop the railway station redevelopment. It doesn't seem to me that that's the end of the story at all. There's a larger public interest that's involved here. Interesting.
Senway, in the country, I mean, you've travelled to many countries, and I'm interested in when does urbanisation fail? What are the catastrophic examples of urbanisation that you've witnessed?
Absolutely. You only need to travel to some cities. For example, I was in Mumbai, Bombay. From the port area to the airport takes about 2 hours. And all along the streets you see slums. hundreds of millions of people moving to cities around the world. I mean, this is just one example. And what do they end up with? Living in slums. But then again...
And that's the urban reality of
that's
the majority
reality
of cities,
yeah.
really.
The only big example of somewhat success, I would say, is China. China has managed to absorb about, 300 million odd people into the urban areas without the creation of massive slums that you see around the world.
How have they done that? Well, is that all about planning?
There's a few issues here and there. But
some people argue that the slums in China are largely hidden.
Yeah, it's. There are slums definitely, but a lot less than many other large cities around the world. So definitely, but one thing that I see that's positive is that the investment in renewable energies, for example, because one thing that's important to power cities around the world, we're absorbing a lot of people. We have to absorb a lot of people. We need to actually generate power from renewable energies.
I wonder too whether you certainly when new high-rise. Lots of the new high-rise developments go up in Australian cities now. I often think, what a missed opportunity. They could have made this an absolute showcase for renewables or good design or solar passive or, Do you think that we are not taking all the opportunities that we could be?
I think so. We are blessed with abundant sun here. We've got a lot of land to put in wind turbine. For example, in the last 2 years in China has invested more in renewable energy than what we're producing annually in terms of electrical power output. So it's possible for us to actually be very close to 100% renewable. And there's a good book around that actually explains the step-by-step on how to do it.
Do we have a moral obligation to actually address our footprint? And if the rest of the developing world wants to, if they aspire to live how we do on our quarter-acre block, we can't sustain that. So should we be providing, a better example?
A question about our carbon footprint. A good one. I noticed that in Scientific American last month they did an entire special on cities and the fact that they might be a solution to the problems of our age. Bernard, is this one of them?
Well, look, I agree. It's not just the carbon footprint and all that goes with that. It's a question of inefficiency. The idea of living in the burbs and commuting into the CBD is a 20th century concept. It's a 19th century concept. The technology has simply changed from trams, trains to automobiles. The 21st century response to that is to take jobs to the people. Now, Kim has said, well, we need to be focusing on public transport or diverting funds away from highways or motorways or whatever, while we're waiting for the politicians to actually make that decision to redirect funds from motorways to railways. My idea of decentralising actively, proactively, decentralising jobs, I think, is the best way to achieve the reduction in the carbon footprint. Have a look at and the best example of this has come out of Melbourne. About 4 years ago, the TAC, the Transport Accident Commission, was decentralised from Exhibition Street to Geelong. 770 jobs came out of the CBD and went to Geelong. Made not a jot of difference, really, to the CBD, but a big difference to Geelong. Let's not decentralise necessarily to Geelong, but to Werribee, to Broadmeadows, to Moonee Ponds, to Box Hill, to Moorabbin, and containerise the city. I think that would have a bigger impact on reducing our carbon footprint than a lot of other alternative strategies.
Senway, are cities the solution to reducing our carbon footprint, or do they come with all their own baggage?
They're part of the solution. Another solution would be to adopt more green technologies in terms of green building technologies and looking for more cost-effective solutions, but always focusing on how to make it green, but also focusing on how to actually make it feasible, financially feasible for us. I think that's the key.
Do you find it hard to convince governments that it is going to be financially feasible? We were talking about public transport before, a huge capital investment needed in that sort of infrastructure, and, people balk at that.
things like this are always a challenge, obviously, but it's our role to keep on campaigning. For example, pretty soon we're going to be launching a Green Cities criteria, framework, and a checklist. So it's very powerful and very significant because it will help authorities and decision-making people to look at something and say, okay, this is what we need to do. A simple checklist that anyone with a reading age of 14 or above can understand. So it's feasible, it's very readable, but also something that we want to show people and also excite people about what's possible for the future. Because we believe a future where people living in cities and around the world can have clean water, clean air. Our power will be powered by renewable energy, and our transport will be green.
We're a way off yet, aren't we?
The knowledge is already out there. What we need to do is just combine all the great knowledge we have around the world and focus on providing it and making it cost effective.
Kim, do we have a moral responsibility to live in cities so as to reduce our carbon footprint, as the questioner asked?
I don't know if there's any moral responsibility to move to cities. There's certainly a moral responsibility to address the issues of both climate change and global poverty, and I think that they largely go together. So I do see a moral responsibility there, and I think particularly for any new city infrastructure that we're putting in, the moral responsibilities become quite high. I think it's we should remember that the major decisions we make about street networks, public transport and density have very, very long-term effects, much longer term than putting in place a policy which can be changed, much longer term than building a building which can be demolished. But once you put in place the basic infrastructure and you allow, say, a suburban development to develop at about 10 dwelling units a hectare, Australians will come, they'll put down their roots and they will then defend that density almost forever. We often forget that the things that we value about cities have come about through a whole series of layers. There's a natural environment, then there's often an agricultural environment, then there's often the first form of urban layer, and that becomes a kind of a mature suburbia, and then we declare it finished. I don't think that that's valid. I think we've got to say that the suburbs are not yet finished, and that while they're not to be transformed, and in some cases are to be, the values there are to be preserved, we do have to fit them out with a far more sustainable infrastructure.
Great discussion. My question to the panel is, what do you think are the best examples of urban planning in Australia and why?
Great question. And let's try and be national if we can at all. Bernard, do you want to pick that one up?
A good example, I think, is a new community, master planned community, about 20 kilometres southwest of the Brisbane CBD called Springfield. Not Springfield as in The Simpsons, but it was named prior to The Simpsons getting up. But it's now connected to the CBD with an extension to a railway line. It has a motorway which is connected, and also key employers are now relocating to Springfield. So you have jobs, you have public transport, you have motor vehicle transport and population all clustered in that area. And this ultimately will be a community of about 120,000 people. There's probably about 25 to 30,000 people. And this is a project that really didn't get off the ground until about 10 years ago and will be fully developed in about another 10 or 15 years. Master plan communities where you get the bits and pieces right and the policy settings right, that is, state government departments decentralised. That, to me, makes a big difference to the effectiveness and quality of life for people that live in that city.
Sounding a bit like the People's Republic of Bernardistan.
Yeah, that's right.
that you described.
Exactly, that's right.
Any other examples from the panel?
If I can, I'll have two quick ones. One comes from Melbourne. I think that the postcode 3000 project of bringing more and more residential uses into the absolute central city of Melbourne, I think, has been extraordinarily successful. I think that the functional mix of getting more and more people living right in the middle of Melbourne has been, over the last 20 years or so, has been very successful.
And we've seen that to an extent in Canberra too. There's a slow growth of what was quite desolate place in the centre of Canberra, but now that it's,
these things
people
are often,
living there.
They're often incremental, so you don't see it suddenly. But if you look back 20 years to the very few people who lived in central Melbourne, now to the many tens of thousands of people living in central Melbourne. The other one, with all of its problems, and I think there are quite a few, is the Mandurah rail connection in Perth. Which is, my sister lives in Mandurah, which when I was a kid growing up in Perth, Mandurah was a country town where I went surfing, and now it's a kind of an outer suburb in a very swiftly growing region. And there's a very fast train down there where you can get on the train and parcel the cars on the freeway. It's quite an experience. I think it's got a few problems, but it's worth
out the window at them.
Yeah.
Any other examples? Oh, yep.
There is one more that I'd like to cite. It's called Varsity Lakes. At the southern end of the Gold Coast, around just south of Burleigh Heads. It's a development, a very pleasant residential development around lakes, but Bond University is headquartered there as well, and there is a plan to, and there is activity around concentrating jobs. So you have jobs, education, and residential, these integrated communities where you have everything local. To me, that is clearly the way of the 21st century.
Can't that sometimes feel all a bit parochial and local, though? I mean, you were talking about...
you can't have it both
the
ways.
thing about cities being so exciting is that there's a sort of sense that you're part of a global community.
Yeah, well, you can't have it both ways. I think that if you want a city that is sustainable, that reduces carbon footprint, where you don't have people commuting 50 kilometres from the edge of Melbourne or from the edge of Sydney into the CBD, then you have to containerise the city. And the trade-off is, you don't get the frisson, you don't get the Paddington, the Carlton sort of edginess out in those places, but you do get a great quality of life. So there's a trade-off to be had there.
Anyone been to the States and got a sense of what's worked and what hasn't?
Well, I think New York, I mean, you can't get a better city for that than Manhattan Island in terms of public transport. Manhattan Island has 8 million people. The greater metropolitan area has 23 million people. There are subway lines going up and down that island. It's about 5 or 6 of them just going straight up and down. It's a very efficient way to get 8 million people or 23 million people from one place to another place. In terms of bad cities in America, I don't think you need to look any further than Phoenix, Arizona. Same size as Melbourne. At the end of the Second World War, Phoenix, Arizona had 200,000 people. It's now 4.5 million people, just sprawled in every direction, very much a car-based city and very much where we don't want to go. But America is, it's in any field, you've got the best and worst.
But New York's interesting, isn't it? Because you sometimes just have to retreat to Central Park, heaving for air. Yeah. Trying to fill your lungs with fresh air and,
Yeah, look, it's interesting. I mean, New York certainly is big and dense and so forth, 23 million people in the broader metropolitan area. If you want to see big and dense, then go to Tokyo, biggest city on the planet, 34 million people. And it actually operates in a very efficient way. You may not want to live there by Australian standards, but the Japanese do a pretty good job of accommodating and transporting and feeding and providing a reasonable quality of life for a population of almost twice Australia in one city. It's an extraordinary piece of mechanism when you actually are in it.